Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just giving a few more minutes, maybe 1 minute more, 1 or 2 minutes more, as we're seeing people are still joining the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. This webinar is titled "Away from and Back to Democracy: Comparing Pathways to Incumbent-Led Autocratization and Strategies of Democratic Resistance." My name is Sarah Ann Rennick. I am the Deputy Director for Research at the Arab Reform Initiative. And today's webinar is the third in our series that is looking at renewing the path to democracy amid crisis. This is a series of webinars that we've been organizing to consider in particular the case of Tunisia and the political trajectory of Tunisia, which went from a process of democratization to de-democratization, where we've seen a very important democratic backsliding. And the purpose of this series of webinars is really to place Tunisia into a comparative perspective along a lot of different analytical frameworks, the way we're thinking about this process of de-democratization, of democratic backsliding, to compare Tunisia and see what we can learn about the Tunisian case, but also about other cases through this process of comparison. So today's webinar is being recorded. So this will be made available after. The other two webinars in the series, the earlier two, are also available on our website. And for just as before I introduce the speakers, just for those who are interested, we do have simultaneous translation available. You just have to click on that function on the Zoom to click into Arabic. And so today's webinar, we'll be running this as a discussion. It will not be a series of individual presentations, but rather a discussion between myself and our four amazing speakers that we have gathered here today. We have four people who are all working on this topic of incumbent-led autocratization and strategies of democratic resistance. I'm joined today by Bedir Mutlu, who is a PhD student in political science at George Washington University. Dr. Pelin Ayhan Musil, who is a senior lecturer in international relations and diplomacy at Anglo-American University. Dr. Claudio Baldiracchi, who is a postdoctoral fellow in political science at the University of Florence. And Dr. Suzanne Gibril, who is a postdoctoral fellow at CV Paul Omam at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And so today's webinar is going to be looking exactly at all these different trajectories that we can see and identify in the process of incumbent-led re-autocratization. We're really interested in looking at how democratic leaders utilize different tools at their disposal in order to unwind and backroll the democratic institutions and democratic processes. What we've seen over the last 20 years is that there's a multiplication, but also a diversification in these pathways to re-autocratization. And we're interested in exploring what are these different pathways, whether they are through processes of legislative capture, in which an incumbent has the benefit of a large party, a dominant political party, and is able to use the legislature in order to unwind institutions, whether it is through mobilization of publics, through things like referendums that allow for a popular legitimization of the process of autocratization, or whether it's through executive power grabs in the cases of, for example, minoritarian rule. So the objective is to really explore what are these different pathways. And the reason why these are important is not just for analysis, but also because it has an important impact on democratic resistance. What are the different possibilities for oppositional actors to mount a resistance and to fight for their democracy? So we're really interested in this webinar in looking at those two dimensions, the trajectories of the unwinding of democracy and what kinds of spaces and arenas that opens, what kinds of coalitions become possible, what kind of pathways can be utilized by pro-democracy actors in order to reignite the process of democratization, mount this resistance. So as I said, we will be running this webinar today as a discussion between the four speakers, each of who has different expertise on this topic, different comparative examples in which they're going to be drawing. And after the discussion amongst the panelists, we will then open it up to the question and answer with the audience. At that point, you can use the function, the question and answer function on Zoom in order to ask your questions. Okay, to get started, I wanted to start actually with Claudio, with you, because you have done extensive comparative work on this example and have a lot of cases from more of a global comparative analysis to draw from. And I'm wondering, based on your empirical research, based on this comparative analysis of democratic backsliding, do you find any consistent patterns, any consistent pathways that incumbents utilize in order to roll back democracy? And are there any new trends that we've seen emerging recently, or are there large typical pathways that you can identify?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that to identify pathways to non-democracy, so the way pathways that incumbents follow to unravel democracy, it's very important first to recognize diversity of cases of autocratization. Obviously, there are different modes of autocratization. Can be sudden transitions to non-democracy. There can be more gradual transitions to non-democracy. But even when we consider specific modes of autocratization, specific category of autocratization processes, for example, gradual transitions to non-democracy, then there is a significant diversity of autocratization cases. So, for example, the debate in recent years has been, as you were mentioning, has been really influenced by specific subsets of cases, typically characterized by popular leaders with an anti-establishment narrative. Think, for example, about the cases of Turkey, Hungary, and so they have been very influential. But then, in recent research that I conducted with my colleague Luca Tomini, we show that once we consider, even considering the specific category of gradual transitions to electoral autocracy, then it's possible to note that there are cases that diverge significantly from these more influential cases. So this is not to say that these cases characterized by popular anti-establishment leader are not important. Not at all. They are important, but there are many other cases where autocratizers, the party of autocratizers, did not control a majority or hyper majority in the legislative body, and they did not have an anti-establishment discourse. On the contrary, sometimes they openly defended the establishment, the status quo. So it's very important, we argue, to consider the differences between autocratizers in terms of their personal features and their available means. And this is also important, and then I get to the point of identifying specific pathways to non-democracy, is that these differences, for example, controlling a majority or hypermajority in Congress, having an anti-establishment narrative, also have an impact on the strategies that autocratizers follow, which is to a certain extent intuitive, in the sense that, well, if the party of a leader has a majority, so if a leader, an autocratizer, has significant ability to win institutional power through popular support, and if these leaders have an anti-establishment narrative, then referenda, for example, as you were mentioning, and adoption of new constitution will be both be viable, and they will both make sense. They will suit their goals. But these tools will not be available to leaders who have limited ability to win institutional power through popular support. And so they will need to resort to different tools. And what are these tools? Well, intuitively, they will need to, for example, rely on power sharing deals, and then also for example, when it comes to manipulations in the electoral arena, well, then they will need to resort to a more significant extent on manipulations on the election day, which we think is interesting, because one of the most consolidated findings in the literature has been that today's autocratizers actually tend to resort to pre-electoral manipulations. So they skew the playing field rather than stealing elections in the classical way, because obviously these manipulations tend to be less risky. They have fewer legitimacy costs, but then sometimes they are so unpopular, or they are not particularly popular, so that they will be forced to rely on electoral manipulations on the election day. So I'm referring to ballot stuffing and so on. And so I think it's very important to recognize diversity within autocratization processes, but then within this diversity, it's also possible to identify strategic trends. And just would like to conclude by saying that these differences have also very important practical implications. If we think, for example, in terms of resistance strategies, because one thing is to deal with leaders who are very popular and have an anti-establishment narrative. One other thing is to deal with relatively unpopular, or at least not particularly popular autocratizers. And so the point is that resistance strategies should be tailored around these differences. And I think we should avoid just to think about one-fits-all resistance strategies.
Sarah, you are muted.
Sorry, thank you. I didn't realize I was still muted. Thank you. I was just saying thank you for that overview and for sort of situating the discussion and identifying some of those trends that we can still see in common, but also the importance. I probably will have some questions for you when we get back, but I will allow us to go through with other people and opening it up, of course. For Pelin, since you work specifically on the case of Turkey, this is a prime example of incumbent-led re-autocratization or autocratization. I'm wondering if you could provide us an overview with how Erdogan has been able to consolidate this process, both institutionally and popularly. And what other cases around the world do you see as being most similar to this Turkish model?
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Also, I'm really happy to be among colleagues whose scholarly work that I am following closely, and I'm even using their articles in my classes for my students. So I'm glad that I'm familiar with the names that I'm with today. So yes, Turkey is indeed widely recognized as a textbook example of autocratizations, and it's a case of autocratization that happened not suddenly, but in a very gradual and subtle form. Even Erdogan was known as a Democrat in early and mid 2000s. He was popularly elected in fair and you can say almost like free conditions in 2002, in 2007. And he boosted his popularity. I'm saying he because he's charismatic, of course, leader. We know mainly him as a strong populist figure, but also his party was a strong electoral machine that enabled him to be in power for a long time. So basically, it followed this textbook example of autocratization, of dismantling the checks and balances. First, not supermajority, but majority in parliament, and afterwards being able to pass laws in a partisan way because you control the parliament, and second, control the media, and through a constitutional referendum, then capture the judiciary. So this is like it. You can consider it like a period of 10-15 years, and it is continuing. It's a case that continues autocratization, and as of March this year, We also see some experts, and including myself, like calling Turkish case, is it in the process of deepening authoritarianism? When it used to be a case of democratic backsliding, now is it actually continuing in a process of deepening autocratization? But the question about which particular case is similar to Turkey depends on which angle you are taking. When we talk about cases similar to the Turkish case, do we talk about the similarity of incumbent strategies that Claudia mentioned, like in manipulating elections? Or do we talk about the similarity of the context that provided the incumbents a similar source of power for undoing the institutions? Or do we talk about the similarity of the political system at the onset of autocratization? Are we talking about also the length of autocratization and so on? So in my own research, I mainly compared Turkey with the case of Hungary for the reasons that I kind of observed similar processes at the onset of autocratization, and the way autocratization unfolded was very similar. The way opposition reacted to autocratization was similar. So I will basically draw parallels between these two cases in order to answer the question, but I also want to highlight that today I see the two cases as being very separating from each other, which I will mention at the end. So also please remind me of the time, and I will try to be brief. So first of all, I think there was a really major contextual similarity, like with regard to the impact of external actors, which is the EU influence. Of course, Hungary is a member state, and Turkey has been an official candidate country, but that there has been EU influence in both. So both Erdogan and Orban boosted their public support and their charisma also by referring to EU as an enemy, or like this anti-Brussels rhetoric actually kind of was very strong in both cases, like with Erdogan saying we will never bow down to the West. So the West in both cases was synonymous to EU in a way. And interestingly, both of them were quite pro-European in the first term they were in government. Like Orban government, 1998 to 2002 was quite pro-European, and so was Erdogan in the first time he came to power. But they both capitalized probably on the disappointments of their societies with this process of European integration, which for Turkish case it failed, but also Hungary also kind of did not bring what people probably desire to see. So they capitalized on this anti-European stance, blended it with populism, portrayed their people as the victims and the EU as the enemy, and then the domestic opposition became the ones that allied with the EU against the people. So the first step of autocratization, of creating some enemy and making the people, portraying the people as the victim, was very similar. So at the onset of autocratization, was quite similar. And in this way, their parties dominated the parliaments, and they were able to pass the laws in the most partisan way possible. And they were both able to craft extremely majoritarian electoral systems. Like after a while, okay, you boost your support through a rhetoric, but while you are in power, you're also playing with the institutions. So in Hungary, like these 2-round races in local constituencies, for instance, were replaced with the first past the post system. And Orban played a lot with redrawing the geographic boundaries of the constituencies. And in Turkey, for a while, like Erdogan actually didn't need that much, but the major, when he lost in 2015 for the first time, the majority, he realized that he needs also some crafting, and he came up with a major a change, like changing the system from parliamentary to presidential system. And the main drivers of competition became electoral alliances rather than parties. Like we see that they did these things. And also in both contexts, like there were huge protests while these things were happening. There were also public protests, and they also lost, like while they were winning national elections, they were at the local level also losing in especially urban centers. So they also appeared more to these rural conservative areas, and whereas at the urban centers, they were weaker. So in this sense, it was similar, but I don't know, do I have time, or can I say 2 more minutes, maybe something on that? But also, I don't want to say that the similarities, like this most similar, it really depends on the angle you are asking. So I think the similarities are related to the onset and the strategies at the beginning. But of course, Turkey has been much more repressive against its opposition, jailing the main opposition figures, like party leaders, which has never happened in Hungary. And so like the imprisonment, the repression, the stick is much more visible in the Turkish case than in a Hungarian case. And also, if you look at today's perspective, the differences are now much bigger, because I think Orban's electoral power is in serious decline, and where the defector parties have become, that's for me a puzzle, by the way. The defector parties have become very strong. The one main defector party which defected from the ruling bloc is really seriously challenging Orban, whereas in the Turkish case, the defection never led to such a huge challenge to Erdogan. Actually, the defecting parties were very weak. And today it's also very difficult to say that Erdogan is weaker like Orban, because it is crushing the opposition at a level that has never been that serious before. Like the main opposition party, the way it is trying to crush the main opposition party is very intense. Of course, we still are confronted with uncertainty of what may happen, but today we can actually see that Turkey is more often compared with Venezuela, whether Turkey can ever become a Venezuela, because also in the Venezuelan case, the major opposition candidate was banned from elections in 2024, and today Erdogan is trying to do the same. Like he jailed the main opposition candidate, and the opposition, if you look at the polls in Turkey, is really gaining momentum. Has become much stronger than before. If there is an election today, it is possible and to oust Erdogan, of course, if there is a fair playing field. But is Erdogan going to let this happen? It doesn't seem feasible. It's trying its best to really repress. So in that sense, it becomes more similar. The outcome of autocratization, let's say, if you ask from this angle, today it's maybe better to compare Turkey to Venezuela and learn lessons from Venezuela, why it continued to fail, and what can prevent this outcome in Turkey. But right now the direction is it's going in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think that makes a really nice compliment to Claudio's presentation on how these are trajectories, and there's multiple pathways even within the trajectory. There's not just one, and then once you're on that pathway, you end up at a certain destination, and the need to keep analyzing the contextual factors and the decision-making, strategic decision-making by both the authoritarians, but also by the opposition. I wanted to turn to Verdihan, who you work on the Tunisian case. You've done work on the Tunisian case. And in light of the two previous presentations, I'm wondering how you situate the case of Tunisia and the decision-making, the strategizing that was undertaken by Kais Said, both initially, but also how he's been adapting along the way in this comparative way, and in sort of this understanding of how we can understand what we mean by a trajectory to begin with.
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, it's a big pleasure for me to be here at ARI because some years ago I was an intern at Arab Reform Initiative while I was in Tunisia. It's a pleasure to be here with people from ARI, but also others here too. Really, really interesting points about the general trends in Turkey, and there are a couple of points I think that are worth mentioning about the Tunisian experience. First thing to mention, I think, is to recognize how recent the Tunisian experience of democratization was, right? Because Turkey, if you go back to the constitution of 1876, had a parliament for the first parliament in Turkey was 150 years ago, right? Or even if you count just post 1950, it's still 75 years of history of democratization. In Tunisia, the first ever free elections in the history of the country happened in 2011, right? So this is a much recent case of going towards democracy. And what was at stake, or what the Tunisian people set on to achieve was a very, very big task, something that other countries have taken decades, if not centuries, to accomplish. That's, I think, important to recognize. And the second thing that's worth it to also note is that there's a couple of consequences of that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But when we talk about autocratization, what's really striking in Tunisia was how rapid it was, right? We talked about the rapid versus more gradual pathways. In Tunisia, Kais Saied, what we call staged what we call a self-coup or autogolpe in political science on July 25th, 2021. And on that day, the parliament was blocked by army tanks. He froze the parliament to control of significant parts of the judiciary, and did this under a constitution article that he himself wanted to interpret in a specific manner. And this was him de jure taking control, as you were saying, taking control of the judiciary, of the legislative. And he started pressuring bureaucracy after this point too, these are usually the main guardrails that protect the democratic system from autocratic incumbent takeover. And within a year, you had a constitutional referendum in Tunisia in 2022 on the first anniversary of the coup, of the self-coup, with only 30% turnout, but with an overwhelming yes vote. So almost all of these powers were de jure now given to Kais Saied, right? And at the end of that year, you had parliamentary elections. And so I was in Tunisia from 2020 to 2022 summer, and I was there. I was not there exactly on July 25th when this 2021, but I was there after that, and I could see things moving gradually within a year, right? Within a year, you could see more police on the streets. You could see people getting detained and harassed. Things did not change on day one after this happened, but towards the end of 2022, you started to see really a rise in arrests for political opponents, activists, journalists. In 2022 April, one of the former speaker, one of the main conservative figures in Tunisia, Rashid Ghannouchi, was arrested, along with him many other people. Abu Musi was arrested after that. So it took a year more or less for the regime to really come really strong against opposition. And then there was a presidential election in 2024. again, the turnout rate was something like 28%, but Kais Saied was with 90%. And again, there's in the Tunisian case, the things that the system is autocratic in a very visible way, right? I don't think we can speak of democracy when there's a 28, 25, or in the legislative election is as low as 11%, a historic level around the world. You can't really see democracy. And again, the playing level, there was no playing field left anymore, almost all the major political figures were arrested, right? The journals, the media was under extreme pressure. Bureaucracy was under extreme pressure, and bureaucracy in Tunisia. That's what I was talking. That's why it was important for me to mention the historical legacy. The bureaucracy in Tunisia has had, and I've seen this even throughout 10 years of democratization process. The bureaucracy in Tunisia was still scared, and they had muscle memory, and they were not. And they went back to where they were before 2011 very quickly because they knew what happened before, and they knew what was going to come for them. A couple of specificities about Tunisia is that Kais Saied had a very anti-partisan approach. Unlike Erdogan, who had a very strong party apparatus backing him, especially in the beginning of his term, and he had really people who had legitimacy in their local circles too, especially in 2002. Kais Saied really came out as a one man, as an independent, as an out of system. He was the out of system candidate, that's for sure, in 2019 when he was elected, right? And he never founded a party, and up to today he does not have a political party, right? And he ideologically is anti-partisan, but also strategically anti-partisan, I think, because um, he came he had a movement, a mass movement. A lot of young people supported him, and still is trying to solidify his movement. I think he had some obstacles potentially in that, but again, he never intended to. He never intended to create a political party, and he banned political elections be run based on political parties, right? So this is part of what we call this anti-establishment rhetoric, because the party is people were in Tunisia, there was a very anti-partisan sentiment in the sense that people were not happy with the political parties that took power after 2011 revolution, and this became very visible in 2019 elections, which were democratic. Um, so this anti-partisan stance is, I think, very special to Tunisia. And the nationalist rhetoric is there for sure. But again, what Pelin mentioned is that they have to sometimes, I mean, when you're in government, you cannot go not negotiating with key international institutions, right? Tunisia is still trying to negotiate with the IMF, for instance. That's a big part of it. Because Tunisia is in economically a very dire situation, much worse than I think Turkey. I mean, that's another point in that when the Tunisian revolution occurred, the GDP per capita was something a little bit below $4,000, right? Turkey, when autocratization happened, again, we're talking about something a little bit below 4,000 US dollars per capita income. In Turkey, it was about 12K, right? So again, Turkey actually here is more exceptional than Tunisia is, because we know from political science is that as income level of country increases, there usually what's expected is that autocratization becomes harder generally. In Turkey, it happened at a relatively high income or richness rate. And Tunisia was not a particularly rich country. It was a very lower middle income country. So again, it was not necessarily that surprising potentially that this happened in Tunisia, but the rate of change at which it happened was really, I think, spectacular. What Erdogan did in maybe 10, 15 years, Kais Saied managed to do in 1 or 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for providing some context about how everything's happened in such a condensed time and the importance of that and understanding the dynamics at play in Tunisia. Okay, turning to Suzanne and the question of democratic resistance and your research on this field of how different actors kind of mount these strategies for democratic resistance in the face of democratic backsliding. I'm wondering what trends you find in the comparative studies of these strategies of democratic resistance. Who are the main actors involved? What are the different types of strategies? And what differences do you observe between regime types?
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really glad to be surrounded by all these specialists and to be discussing this today. It's a very important topic. especially given what's happening in some of our liberal democracies as well. So it's a central issue. To answer your question, I wanted to start by saying that when considering resistance, I think one needs to bear in mind two key aspects. The first is that resistance is not a static reaction to autocracy. It's a dynamic and adaptive process that unfolds across formal as well as informal arenas. And the second aspect is, or the shapes or the forms that resistance will take will depend heavily on the regime type, the availability of space to perform such resistance, as well as the legacies of past mobilizations, whether they were successful or not. And generally, so in the literature, we usually speak of 4 general categories of actors when we speak of resistance, whether it's resistance against authoritarianism, so established autocracies, or regimes going through processes of autocratization. The first category of actors, some of our speakers talked about them already, are the institutional actors, so the institutional and political actors, so courts of justice, political parties, independent judges, bureaucracy, all of those actors that can make use of legal and political mechanisms to resist autocratization processes or authoritarian rule. And then comes what we call the civil society organizations. So all these actors included in unions, professional orders, various associations, human rights groups, all those groups and actors that mobilize public opinion and broker a certain legitimacy within civil society. The third category includes what I refer to as cultural actors, symbolic actors. So all of these actors that pertain to the cultural sphere, artists, singers, dancers, poets, even football supporters sometimes. So all of those actors whose real power lies in their capacity to frame narratives and to produce what Asif Bayat calls these alternative and everyday acts of resistance. And that's what I focus specifically on in my own research. So how these actors of the cultural sphere interact with power incumbents and how they adapt their strategies to avoid repression and, let's say, authoritarian rule. And then you have the fourth category of actor, which includes the international or the external actors. So those actors that can make use of diplomatic pressure more or less successfully. And this is a category of actor that obviously can be further discussed, especially in terms of their actual success in resisting authoritarian rule. And when we apply these different categories to my case studies, the case studies that I know best, which are the Egyptian and the Tunisian cases, well, they offer instructive contrasts, especially in terms of strategies used. In Tunisia, especially between 2011 and 2021, civil society organizations such as the labor unions, the UGTT, or the Lawyers' Order played a central role in negotiating transition and preserving this institutional legitimacy. But as Badir Khan was saying, since Said's election, and especially since he suspended parliament and dismissed the government in July 2021, we've been witnessing a fragmentation of these social actors, I would say, and a selective co-optation of these actors, in addition to an upsurge in repression and censorship. And this consequently leads to this once vibrant civic space now struggling to produce a unified resistance, partly because the institutional repertoire has lost some of its credibility. That's for the Tunisian case. In Egypt, meanwhile, Egypt saw a much earlier and harsher closure of the political space after Sisi's power grab in 2013. So here, from the get-go, so from the start, resistance took a much more symbolic form, often resorting to these cultural avenues and tools of resistance. I remember when I was conducting my doctoral research, so between 2015 and 2019, when I was interviewing these ultras members, these football supporters, as well as these street artists and the rappers, they were describing their use of the stadium, the tifos, the banners, the songs, the frescoes, the street art as very efficient tools to circumvent repression and censorship. They were using this as a coded language of dissent and opposition. And what was observable and interesting in the Egyptian case was first the collaboration between the different actors of the cultural sphere, but also their capacity to gain territorial control of the streets as well as the digital spheres and transform them into these small microcosms of defiance and resistance. So their use of the metaphors and the symbols, whether through their art or in their lyrics, allowed these actors of resistance to bypass state surveillance, which was something that was quite rare at the time. Also bypass police brutality, even in the absence of mass protests, which was something that was quite new in the Egyptian case at that time. And this lasted some time, or at least until the state adapted its repressive tools and violently dismantled their networks. And that started in 2015, all through 2019. Well, and obviously after that, but throughout my observations, these spaces of resistance, these spaces of contention were violently dismantled. The networks were violently dismantled, and they also started increasing online control and repression through the use of digital tools, such as tracking services, but also more and more through these AI bots. So what we see throughout these two examples is that regime type will clearly shape the strategic horizons of resistance. In hybrid regimes, like pre-2021 Tunisia, actors often still revert to these institutional alleys of resistance, combined with civil society work, as well as maybe more cultural work. So they engage in this legal contestation and the negotiation and the use of public discourse to resist the authoritarian drift or the process of autocratization. While in closed authoritarian systems, such as post-2013 Egypt, resistance will shift to more covert forms, so less visible forms of resistance, often even going underground. And it becomes less about the immediate institutional change and more about preserving memory, preserving dignity, and alternative moral orders through culture, through humor, through even symbolic acts of defiance. Now, of course, these dynamics are not only confined to authoritarian or transitioning regimes. We've seen it in liberal democracies. I can think of the Black Lives Matter movement, the feminist movement, who engage in what is fundamentally resistance work. They're reframing who democracy is for, what it should mean in practice. And these are not simply issue campaigns. They challenge the social architecture of democratic legitimacy. So I'd say to conclude this first question, I would say that democratic resistance is not only about stopping autocratization or restoring institutional checks. It's about sustaining political imagination under constraint. It's about the ability to imagine other futures or rehearse other futures, to defend these spaces of solidarity and to refuse the imposition of silence or the imposition of coercion, I would say. So resistance is not only reactive, it's cumulative, it's creative, it's adaptive, and it's deeply rooted in the historical and symbolic struggle of the place it's being developed in. And in that sense, I think that the key question here that we ask is not just, was resistance successful or not, but rather, how do these actors sustain possibility or preserve democratic memory and prepare for a reconfiguration, even when all these visible routes or active routes appear blocked. And that is, I believe, at the heart of democratic resistance and the reason it deserves a closer comparative attention in this regard.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the comparison of the two cases, the deep dive into that comparison between Egypt and Tunisia. Turning back to Pelin, I'm wondering if you could talk about what democratic resistance looks like in Turkey today. What have been some of the more successful strategies, and why do you think these have succeeded? And of course, drawing on what Suzanne just explained about how we can think about what we mean by success. And success might not just be the restoration of different institutions or other forms of practice. And also, where do you see that this resistance has been able to best flourish in either sectoral terms or institutional terms or even sociological terms?
Thank you. Well, your question is about success. I nowadays tend to focus on what explains failure, but I will, of course, it is also related with how to prevent failure, and which is automatically success. So, I mean, right now, of course, like as I mentioned earlier, like Turkey has reached a phase in which we cannot call anymore democratic backsliding, but rather is it really going to, if there's an election one more time, is it going to be like it is going to be more than just manipulation of the institutions, or whether actually the results will be refused by the government, or like similar to Venezuela, when opposition claimed like that they won the election, but the government declared that that actually this result was not what they think is. Like the official results for Venezuela was 51 in favor of the government representative, whereas opposition had said we won actually 67% of the votes. So at that moment, it was a really strategic moment when finally the electoral outcome was contested. So far in the Turkish context, in previous elections, the election results were not really contested, were kind of approved, and Erdogan, no matter what, manipulated the electoral institutions, but always won. So, and for the first time, I think the people see that this is where the country is heading, and Turkey is a country of 70 years of democratic experience since 1945, 50 is better to say. So people are used to voting and seeing that they are like that actually elected representatives rule. Of course, it was interrupted by military interventions, but military interventions have always been temporary. So it is very difficult for a country with this experience to move into a closed autocracy, whereas today it is still considered to be electoral authoritarian regime. But we see that this is the goal of the government. We can very now confidently we can very confidently say that this is the goal of the government, to move the country to that direction. So this is a very interesting context to see what will really happen. Resistance versus like those that are really trying to impose, as Susan mentioned, coercion, and to what extent people will be able to sustain this imagination of resistance. And I think one thing about the Turkish case is that I think this resistance came at a very later stage. It came at a stage where, you know, the process is heading toward close autocracy, or this where the government wants to take the country is a close autocracy. So this is a very late stage, and people started protesting. No, we cannot accept this. Whereas, for instance, if you look at Serbia, those large-scale protests, another country where it still continues, it happened after a corruption scandal. So there is also a very major difference. which means that it's more difficult in Turkey, I think, to achieve success today, but it is not impossible. So to answer your last part of your question, actually, today, the major field of resistance is, of course, the streets, the social realm. The political parties have so far been contesting the autocratization in elections. Let's say for the last 12 years. The last largest protest happened in 2013 with Gezi protests, but since then the government basically did its best to make sure such a protest will never happen again. It's basically portrayed those protests that happened 12 years ago. They linked it to a terrorist organization and really jailed some prominent civil activists and used the courts basically as a tool of repression to give the lesson to people that if you go to protest, this is what will happen. So for 12 years, Turkey did not see such a large-scale protests, probably because of this feeling of insecurity. But once the Turkish government went so far as to imprison the most important oppositional figure, that was the only time that actually finally triggered another momentum for protests. So it is mainly happening in the streets, and the parties are today also in the streets. Like parties, meaning the main opposition party is allying with the demonstrators. We see a very strong coexistence between people's demonstrations and the party. Whereas in the past, it has been the elections. So what has been, like, again, your question is about success. Like at the national level, national elections, the opposition has not been successful yet to oust the government from power. But at local elections, it was able to do that. So the success story we can look at today at the local level. How was it possible for opposition to win the elections in Turkey, like in Istanbul, for instance, which was also the major stronghold of the government? So if you ask me 3 years ago, and I wrote about this also, that opposition coordination among parties, I would say, is the most important factor for helping opposition to oust the government from power. And it's also like quite acknowledged in the literature, which means that opposition parties, when at the time before the time of elections, they form an alliance, and because the institutions have become so majoritarian that opposition parties alone cannot compete alone, and they have to form a joint struggle, let's say nominate a joint candidate, which happened both again in Turkey and the other country that I focused more, Hungary. So they were able to unite. But at the same time, both cases show that at the national elections, this particular strategy failed. While in both cases, I mean, at the local level, it worked. One can say that the local elections and the mechanisms for local elections and the mechanism for national elections work differently. Of course, in national elections, the institution set up for national competition, first of all, is different. And sometimes also at national elections, like, of course, the government is able to control more the rhetoric than the local elections, which has their own local, like the local culture may be different, but this coordination between parties really worked in local elections, and they were able to beat the pro-government candidates very well. But it failed at the national level. So when I think about it again, why opposition coordination may fail, it's also important that when so many opposition parties work together against one strong government, which is usually represented by a strongman figure, it doesn't seem to be also very convincing for the undecided voters. And still, countries like Turkey have a strongman culture, and they want to see a strongman figure as ruling the country, which kind of does not happen when so many opposition parties work together. And they also, like, the parties lose their own identity for the sake of coming together. And in the end, it doesn't provide a very convincing image for the voters. So this is like, in terms of what fails, and like the question is what helps with success. This is a more answer to, like, it can also lead to failure, opposition coordination. Perhaps we should talk about like different forms of coordination, different types of coordination that may actually that may be subtle forms of coordination among parties, which would help them, which would not lead to their loss of their identity, their real party identity. Maybe a sort of coordination where the parties will be able to keep their identity and not lose their core supporters, but at the same time still stand together. Unfortunately, like, the electoral system pushes them to work together, but maybe there are some ways to find that. So that's about elections and opposition coordination as one way of of resistance in the electoral platform. And when it comes to a social level, which is the protests and the people, the timing matters. As I mentioned, that when it is the late stage of autocratization, perhaps, yes, you should be consistently on the streets, but how far is it going to happen? Like, unless the security forces are not there to side with you, how far it can actually go. So, like, then the black box becomes probably the military. Where will the military stand in a situation of really high level instability and protests? So I see this resistance and repression really also, like, step by step influencing each other. Opposition has been quite strong in Turkey, and they worked together, and they showed that they could beat the incumbents at the local level, and they came, like, stronger. But afterwards, like, the government also built another strategy. Okay, so let's take those oppositional figures, like take them to prison, and so, like, very much higher level of repression. And now people are in the streets, are trying to come to this level, but the government is also raising the level of repression. So in the end, we see a really high intensification of, like, of the conflict. And in such situations, I think the main how we will, like, what will be the outcome of this? I think it depends mainly on where the security forces will stand. So basically, do I have some more time, or maybe it's fine? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we won't have time to go back to in the question and answer after. Let's see, to Claudio, I'm wondering, in your research, if you've been able to identify where some gaps may occur in the strategies of re-autocratization, by which I mean, are there either institutional loopholes, or even within relational terms, where the process of kind of shoring up the elite aggrandizement, the concentration of power in the hands of the executive, are there sort of gaps where we can see that this process maybe fails that you've been able to identify? I'm thinking specifically, Pelin had mentioned the case of Hungary and how there's the defection of the parties now. Is this an example, for example, of where these gaps may occur? And do you have any insights about why these gaps maybe occur?
Well, thank you for the question. So first of all, I think so we're used obviously to think about autocratization also in normative terms. So obviously we view autocratization as something negative, but then it may be useful to look at autocratization from the autocratizer perspective. And once we do so, then we realize with even more clearly that autocratization also it's not a simple process for autocratizers. In other words, many things can go wrong for autocratizers, and so the question is what can go wrong and under what conditions. So this can help us to think about resistance and to answer more specifically your question. And so first of all, I think when we think autocratization and re-autocratization, so I think the difference is important when it comes to the causes of these processes. Then I wonder whether the difference between autocratization and re-autocratization, the difference between these two different processes is very relevant when it comes to the conditions that can actually halt these processes. And so, because even when we think about cases of re-autocratization, more specific category, then we realize that this is a very heterogeneous group of countries. So we can find countries as even within the more specific category of gradual transitions to non-democracy. Then we realize that there are as different cases as Georgia, for example, or El Salvador, and so which leads me once again, related to what I said a few minutes ago, to stress the importance of differences within cases of autocratization or re-autocratization to understand what can go wrong, and therefore how can we stop autocratization processes. And so again, very important to think about in terms of the features of autocratizers and the available means of autocratizers. So for example, when it comes to cases of autocratization where the party of the chief executive does not control a majority or hypermajority in the legislative body, then of course the autocratizer will be forced to build an autocratization coalition, even in Congress. I mean, obviously, autocratizers always build social-political autocratization coalitions, but then, even within the legislative body, the autocratizer will be forced to build such a coalition. And obviously, I think, in that case, that's where things can go wrong for autocratizers, because, there can be defections. Obviously, there can be defections, in any case of autocratization, but more specifically when the party of the chief executive does not have a solid majority in Congress. And so, obviously, I think, it would be interesting, as you mentioned, just to try to understand when defection can happen. And so there has been some recent research that shows, for example, that international pressure can, of course, make defections more likely. And so then it may sound intuitive, but I think that a moment in which things can go wrong for autocratizers, and therefore a moment in which autocratization can be stopped is at the beginning. I think Pelin was mentioning timing. And so that's a moment when autocratizers are more vulnerable. So especially if we're talking, as we're doing, about autocratization processes starting in a democracy. So there's still some levels of significant levels of freedom. Institutions tend to be independent or are independent, and so that's a moment where I think things can go really wrong for autocratizers. And so timing is very important, and this has actually been underlined by recent research. And then so also especially at the beginning, it's very important. What can halt autocratization is through the activation of constitutional mechanism, institutional mechanism in reaction to specific decision by would-be autocrats. And so think about, for example, impeachment, think about the case of South Korea. But in that case, yes, constitutional mechanisms are very important, but then this needs to be combined with a strong, solid commitment of elite actors to democracy, and that's really crucial. So, for example, I think recently Elisabeth Ziblatt has compared the case of the U.S. And Brazil to show the importance of the commitment of elite actors to democracy.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to turn back to Suzanne. I'm actually going to turn back to something you were mentioning, which is how we can understand what do we mean by success in cases where there is no democracy, in cases of very restrictive, repressive regimes, authoritarian regimes, and how we need to really qualify what we mean as success and think of success not so much as kind of institutionally re-putting into place democracy, but actually maintaining that oppositional consciousness and maintaining, I really liked how you put it, maintaining sort of the capacity to reimagine the future alternatively. And I'm wondering if in the research you've done, beyond this oppositional consciousness and this sort of collective vision, do you see evidence of other forms of abeyance structures that arise within this democratic resistance, whether it's a sort of an organizational capacity that stays into place? Are there active discussions beyond maybe the symbolic, but actually any sort of thinking about what could be a strategy? I'm just wondering how far we can extend that that oppositional consciousness into various forms of both structure that can be reactivated, whether it's organizational networks, but also sort of strategic thinking about the future.
It's such an important question as well. Thanks for that. It's a question that I think remains partly unanswered, and I think that we need to keep nourishing the data. But I think that if we want to understand what makes resistance, I wouldn't say effective, because we'd have to analyze it through time. But I would say what makes resistance durable is situating it in time and context, as Claudia mentioned just a second ago. Because what was the main difference between, I'd say, today and resistance, I'd say, in the past 30 years? And I think that the main difference over the last decade, and maybe the most consequential change in this arena, would be the deep entanglement between physical resistance and digital resistance, physical and digital technologies, whether it's used by these authoritarian powers or whether it's embedded in these resistance practices. As I just mentioned, these resistance strategies in the past really depended on these physical gatherings and the use of traditional media. But today we're seeing that this landscape and the relations between repression and resistance will unfold in parallel. So they're unfolding physically in physical ecosystems, but they're also unfolding online. Because of the capacity of these authoritarian regimes to increasingly sophisticate or adapt their uses of these digital tools. They're using more and more these AI-powered surveillance tools. They're using automated censorship to harass activists online. They're using these bot armies to spread fake information. And most noticeably in this, for example, if I go back to the Tunisian case, this post-2021 period, you see an upsurge, a growing number of defamation campaigns that target journalists and activists, and these campaigns emerging or originating from these anonymous sources and pro-regime social media accounts. Same goes for Egypt. Some of the activists, some of my personal contacts as well, they've been prosecuted based on sometimes encrypted WhatsApp messages that were intercepted, or even sarcastic tweets. So that shows you how the repression no longer stops at the purely physical border, but goes beyond and attacks all of this online world as well. That's for the repressive aspect of it. But what is also important to mention is that resistance actors can constantly adapt their tools, and so you have what's called this digitally embedded resistance. So they're not using only online platforms to mobilize, but they're shaping a counter-public sphere, whether it's through their live streams, whether it's through collaborative videos, whether it's through the use of memes, the use of music, the use of TikTok as well, these short reels, for example. That was something that was widely used in Tunisia, where you have activists using these platforms such as TikTok or the reels on Instagram to launch these campaigns parodying Said's speeches. And turning this official state discourse into some kind of a spectacle and even a satire. And even though these small acts of resistance may not seem strategic in the sense of having an institutional impact, they're eroding slowly the regime's legitimacy and the regime's aura within society. If I take another example in Egypt, even though you have this very strong digital chokehold, I would call it, these resistance movements or these resistance hub survive through encrypted collectives or online magazines, diaspora-run podcasts as well. So they're creating this archive of dissent, and they're providing a memorialization of resistance throughout these different activities that are able to expand beyond local borders. So if we want to ask ourselves what kind of strategies endure, I think that I'd like to point out maybe three dimensions that are interlocked and that communicate. The first dimension is having a hybrid coalition that mixes institutional and symbolic resistance. We can see that the most durable resistance tends to emerge when different actors bring different resources, whether it's the unions that offer a certain sense of credibility and have this capacity to dialogue with political actors. You have the cultural figures that create resonance and the archive or the capacity to produce narratives and these ideas of a potential future. You have legal professionals that bring this institutional knowledge. And in Tunisia, this dynamic was really central to the national dialogue between 2011 and even going as far as 2021. And today we're seeing that the reason why resistance is slightly eroded in the Tunisian case is we see this fragmentation, not just politically, but generationally as well, because younger activists today often don't trust the old civil society elite and vice versa. So I think rebuilding those bridges is essential to a successful, I'll use the air quotes, but at least a durable sense of resistance. That was the first dimension. The second dimension, I would say, would be discursive framing and the narrative power. And this is especially important in the digital setting, because when you look at durable movements, they create coherent and compelling counter narratives. Think of the main slogans of the different the different revolutions that have emerged, or even the use of metaphorical lyrics in whether it's Egyptian rap or Tunisian rap, Algerian rap, any type of discursive methods. They use these metaphors and the use of parables and hyperboles to evade censorship, while still retaining this political clarity. And these framings allow these different resistance actors to speak across ideological divides and reach a greater number, which is crucial, especially within polarized societies, or societies that have a wide number of actors interconnecting. And then finally, I'd say that the third dimension is the tactical agility, or the capacity to adapt, especially under pressure. That means that it's the capacity of resistance actors to switch between legal contestation, digital visibility, symbolic disruption, depending on the context, depending on the rapid evolution of events. For instance, I was in Tunisia conducting research between 2022 and 2023. During that time, the repression was at its highest, well, close to its highest anyway. So when these formal spaces of protest were blocked, the groups usually used online flash mobilization. So they were uploading photos of small gatherings in multiple cities at once, and that would enable them to overwhelm state messaging and to overwhelm or to drown out the pro-regime bots, or even the strategic use of what they call state-approved mobilization. For example, one of the only state-approved mobilizations today remains women's rights, and especially feminicides. So this practice of state-approved mobilization refers to this utilization by the various activists of a state-approved struggle, and they use these spaces to gather and to share ideas and other topics, while at the same time mobilizing for a common cause. And this was actually widely used, whether in the Tunisian case, but also the Egyptian case, and I believe the Algerian and Moroccan cases to some extent. So this tactical agility is very important. And another aspect of that is the temporal strategies. It's also knowing when to retreat, when to resurface, when to preserve your resources for future openings. And this was largely used in the Egyptian case, where between 2017 and 2020, still ongoing, but I would say especially 2021, a lot of the activists went underground to ensure their own security. And if I'm trying to think in conceptual terms here, I'd argue that I'd say successful or durable resistance today is less about confronting. We've been talking about this, confronting the regime head on, but more about building this resilient infrastructure of presence, being there, whether it's digitally, culturally, or interpersonally, and that allows resistance to survive these periods between mass mobilizations, or these periods between maybe more openings on the political front. So I'd say that maybe to wrap up a little bit, and going back to these changes these past 10 years, I'd say that the digital tools within these strategies of resistance have not fundamentally change the logic of resistance, but I'd say that they transform the scales, the tactics, and also the temporality, because they've made more, on the one side, they've made repression more diffuse, more or less tangible. But they've also, on the other hand, opened up new terrains for resistance, for subversion, for dissent, and especially in settings that are closing more and more. These areas and these spaces may be the only spaces where opposition and dissenting voices can still be expressed, or where resistance can still breathe. And in that sense, the most enduring strategies are not always the loudest, but they're the most adaptive, connective, and imaginative, I'd say. So ones that allow resistance to recombine, resurface, and go underground when needed, and waiting for the next opening to come.
Thank you so much. And just to end with Bedihan, and the question of Tunisia today, where do you see that democratic energy still lies? You talked earlier about the muscle memory within the institutions and kind of reverting back to almost a default mode. And I wonder if we haven't also seen that in civil society, for example. So where do you see that this energy still is, and where would you see as the points of entry for democratic resistance today, building on what the other speakers have said about how we can think about democratic resistance and where it can come from?
Thank you. I mean, first of all, I think when we look at Tunisia or in other countries, the situation does look a little bit bleak right now, I think. Much more so than what I would have liked personally, we would have liked, I guess. But that's the very reason for which we need, I think, such conversations, because this is in times like this is that we need to think about these things. And one thing that's important to remember is that Tunisian people did this once, right? The people in Turkey did this before. They brought forth democracy and freedom, even for brief periods of time, and even limited. And when the revolution happened in Tunisia, there were what I tried to look at was where does power lie in a society, right? Economically, socially, and especially social power, mobilizing power. And in the 2011 revolution, there were two main bastions of popular resistance or mass resistance. One was the union, UGTT, the mass labor union, and the second was Ennahda, the Islamist movement. They were the ones organizing people in the streets mainly. The civil society came in, the Bar Association came in, all these other civil society actors weighed in for sure, but these were the people with access to grassroots organizing mostly, I think, and some other smaller organizing movements. And the parties in Tunisia were relatively big. I talked about how Kais Saied targeted political parties, but the history of political parties in Tunisia was that, as one of my researches about political parties in Tunisia, is that they were not organized. And that was, I think, one of the reasons why we say autocratization in Tunisia was that the partisan system couldn't institutionalize, and the parties themselves, most of them, remained relatively weak. I mean, the secular opposition party, Nida Tunis, that was brought forth by Bejuket Essebsi, just went into oblivion after he passed away, right? And even Ennahda, which was always lauded to be the strongest party, really lost power throughout 10 years of being part of governing coalitions. And the disconnect that other people I mentioned between the youth and the political, and this is with all the leaves, right? This is for that holds true for a lot of the old civil society, and that holds true for a lot of the political actors too. That there's a distrust in the people who led the 10 years of democratization process in Turkey that especially young people share, I think. And again, so where does energy lie today? Again, one thing that happened in Tunisia is that it happened, as I was saying, people didn't react as swiftly as maybe they could have. Neither did civil society, neither did a lot of the political actors, maybe even the people themselves didn't react. But there are still opportunities, I think, and I think what is really needed in Tunisia is and maybe beyond is to build this power, right? And I really liked what Suzanne Gerbil was telling about the resilience of the opposition. one thing that's positive potentially is that people remember democracy, right? Once you live through it, it's hard to forget a democratic experience. And people know what they gained and what they didn't gain and what they would like to gain. And this is not something that's easily lost. The young people have experiences and they remember it. And they will continue to remember. Things will not be the same ever again for Tunisia, I think. And the second thing that Suzanne Jibril was mentioning is I think I was also going to talk about it as the allowed opposition, right? What does and organizing. And in that, one thing in itself, I think, successful, and Suzanne Jibril, I think, very, very nicely brought up the feminist activism as one example of that. And the other example is the pro-Palestine activism, I think. That I think actually pro-Palestine activism was what built the grassroots or the sort of the structural backbone of a lot of popular opposition in 2011 in Egypt as well, and even in Tunisia. So there was a smooth convoy going from Tunisia by land all the way to Gaza. They were blocked by the Egyptian government, but the organization of such a convoy under an autocratic regime I think, is a big success for the Tunisian civil society. So I think recognizing that such organizing, such mass organizing, that happening, and a lot of these people were young people who were in this, not only, but a lot of young people were involved. I don't know how many social media posts I've seen from my friends or young Tunisians who are not necessarily always all politically involved, right? So acknowledging the willingness of the people to engage in meaningful causes, and really trying to focus on maybe building these kind of organizing momentum. Not necessarily always, again, as I was saying, as Suzanne was saying, confronting regime head on, but really building mechanisms of power and infrastructure is really important. Again, UGTT, I mentioned labor union, co-opted and divided for sure, but it was co-opted and divided in 2011 as well. Yet still, the grassroots or the local activists were able to launch a series of mobilizations against the regime, right? It's important to keep the power structures in place for when the opportunity presents itself. Now, the other point, though, is that I've spoken to several really high level or mid-level Tunisian politicians from the 2011-2021 era, because some of them live in DC where I live. And on their end, one thing that I see relatively different from maybe what's happening under Ben Ali is that um, as disillusioned as the public is, I see very little energy in the diaspora circles among Tunisian opposition today. Very little. They don't. Something I remember. I asked really high level. Are we going to stay in politics? You're going to do something? And he was puzzled by my question. He didn't know what to do. And I'm talking about a very high level political actor in Tunisia. And he was like, politics. His answer was, politics never leaves you. And I'm like, if you are someone who has been head of a political party who has led Tunisian opposition for many years, and your answer is politics never leaves you, I think this is a really big speaking point as to what extent the political elites of the 2011-2021 era is in disarray, even in diaspora, and more so in the on the ground in Tunisia, I think, right? Because a lot of them are jailed now. So I think this is one area in which I think this is very hard to look for a democratic resilience with all the elites. I think they and the people of Tunisia and the young people especially have wanted them gone. That was one of the reasons why Kais Saied was able to get away with it so easily. But on the other hand, what I was saying is that UGTT still is a support. I mean, is a powerful source in Tunisia, right? But just to end with it, now opportunities may present themselves. We don't know when, and actors can try to create those opportunities. As I was saying, building power at this stage is really important, I think, for the Tunisian society. But when the moment comes that an opportunity presents itself, it's important to also recognize the need to translate this power, this societal power, into formal political game. And I think that's what a lot of the activists in Tunisia sort of failed to do after 2011 is to know how to translate the mass mobilization or people's willing to participate into formal politics. A lot of them stayed in civil society. They don't want to go into partisan politics because it's dirty, it's difficult, but it's what's needed for a democracy to run. I think that's how I can add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I realize we've taken up pretty much the entire 90 minutes between the presentations, although I did see that there was a question I was asking. Thank you, Suzanne, for responding to that question. If there's maybe one or two questions from the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function on Zoom, and we can quickly wrap up with that. Maybe give people a minute or two, not even a minute, 30 seconds to see if anyone types in a question. It doesn't seem like it. I'll go ahead. Oh, yes, here's a question from Francesco. To what extent can we talk about learning when examining how opposition actors continuously adapt to the evolving constraints of incumbent-led autocratization to express their dissent? And what can we learn about challenging authoritarian regimes from their learning trajectories? I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that question, any of the speakers.
You need.
Go.
I can try.
Go ahead.
But, it's a very interesting question, and it's a very important question as well, because it's conceptually very rich, isn't it? Because it brings forward this idea of adaptive learning and connecting these opposition strategies to learning under various circumstances I'd say circumstances of autocratization and authoritarian regimes. I think that the main point of or what makes resistance rich in all of its variety is its capacity to learn over time. Just like authoritarian regimes are able to learn and share best practices, if you will, from one another. Resistance actors do the same, and you can see the same types of resistance strategies emerging in different contexts, and they're learning from each other, learning from their mistakes, learning what was successful, what was less successful. So I think that the resistance and autocratization is a learning process, isn't it? You're building. Authoritarian regimes are adapting to the way resistance actors are responding to their repressive strategies, and vice versa. These resistance actors are learning from each other, but also adapting to the repressive measures that are put in place, and it's a continuous phenomenon and a continuous evolution. I think that's what I can say about that, just right off the bat.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add? All right, well, I guess with that, we will go ahead and close this webinar. I really want to thank our speakers for this incredibly rich discussion. It was both very theoretically stimulating, but actually you all managed to kind of distill very key ideas and pinpoint very key trends or key strategies, which I think is very helpful for a lot of different kinds of actors that might have been listening to this webinar today, whether they were other researchers and academics or actually activists themselves. So I really want to thank you for that. As I said, this webinar has been recorded. It will be available on our website. And as part of this series, we will be issuing papers emanating from the webinars, analytical papers. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.